Hey guys, today I'll be sharing my take on an introductory graphic design video. If you've ever wanted to learn about graphic design, you're in the right place. I think the best way to learn these tools is by making a project, so here's a full 40-minute guide on how to make this playing card from scratch by using free and open source software. This video is a bit longer than my normal, but by the end, you'll have learned the skills to make almost anything with Inkscape. So the first thing we're going to do is install Inkscape. Just go to inkscape.org and install the most recent version for your operating system. Another thing you might want to do is install a custom font. I'm going to go to Google Fonts and install a version of Ralloway for this, but you can use whatever you want. This is optional, and if you don't know how to do this, you can look up a tutorial on how to install fonts on your operating system. Okay, so now that we've got all the setup out of the way, let's install Inkscape and start doing a little bit of configuration. I'm using version 1.0.1, although you may have a more recent version depending on how long it took for me to record this video. Something I like to do is set the document size at the start. So you can go to File and you can click on Document Properties, and that'll bring up this window, and you can see a lot of useful things here. So I'm going to set the display units to pixels, and I'm going to also set the dimensions to 1920 by 1080. This doesn't really matter too much for this project, but you might find it useful later. You also notice the page border that might be a bit annoying, so something we can do is hide that. What you want to do is just bring up this menu. You can also see the keybinds in the bottom right, and disable Show Page Border if you don't want to see it. The page border is not going to show up anywhere, it's just a guide, so when you export your image it won't be there. Let's also grab a quick reference image for the subject. I've been playing a lot of Valorant recently and using the Spectre, although I'm pretty terrible at it. So you can just go to the Valorant wiki and save a copy of this image somewhere on your hard drive. So you can go to the File menu and go to Import, or you can hit Ctrl-I, and that will bring up a dialog that'll let us import an image. So I'm just going to bring it here. Once you selected your file, you can just leave the default settings and hit OK, and it will import our nice image. Now with everything set up, we can get started. So first, a couple of navigation tips. If you want to zoom out, you can hold down Control and use your scroll wheel. And there are also a couple of keybinds you can see if you go to View and Zoom. Okay, and before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about what we're going to be doing. This obviously has very complex geometry, so we're only going to try to pull out the most obvious forms that you can see. And one way to tell this is just by squinting your eyes. It's a cool trick because the areas that are less distinctive will just get blurred out, while the more distinctive features are going to remain in focus. And a note about color selection. We're not going to go with the final colors when we start by tracing out. Instead, we're just going to use some temporary ones. So you can go to the palette menu in the bottom right and select Bootstrap. It doesn't really matter which one, but I think this one is the simplest and looks the best. Again, it's not the final color, so it doesn't really matter. Another thing you might want to do is duplicate the reference, just so we have two, since we're going to draw directly on top of one. You can do this by hitting Ctrl-D. And I'm also going to move it out of the page. It doesn't matter, you don't need to work inside the page or anything, it's just a reference. So let's go back to the rectangle tool. I have my color set to a bright blue, and I'm just going to place it here, on top of the barrel. So there are a couple ways of making shapes go right next to each other. You can have clipping, which is enabled by some of the points on the right side, as you can see. That will let you snap to points like the centers or corners of other shapes. But another more convenient way to do this is by just duplicating this shape. I'm going to turn it a slightly different color using Ctrl-D and just scaling it so it flips. And we'll do the same thing here. So I've selected those two, hit Ctrl-D, and flipped it. And you can see that there are 4 distinct shapes here. I'll also make these a slightly different color so we can tell that they're different shapes. Okay, great. Now for the rest of the body, we'll be using more complex polygon tools that let us trace out a custom path that's not just rectangular. So you'll notice that cylindrical shapes tend to be easy to model with rectangles, and if you see an outline, you can hit Shift and select the X on the bottom of the screen. That just means to set the stroke or the outline to a transparent value, and I will go over this in later parts of the tutorial. You can also use these top buttons to change the order in which the things on the screen are drawn. So in case something ends up behind your reference image, you can always just drag it around and see if there's anything under it, and then just raise it to the top. Okay, so we're going to have to use a couple of tools to trace out the path here, and I'm just sort of picking them out. It's very subjective how you do this, but anyways. We want to click on the pen tool, and you want to change this to only using straight line segments. I think that will make things a bit easier. And we're just going to trace, so you can just use your left mouse button and just trace out the main components. If you make a mistake, you can hit Ctrl Z and it will undo the last thing you clicked. And I'm just going to trace out this huge section of the gun. You don't need to do it exactly like I do. If you think other parts are more distinctive or you want to do it to a higher or lower resolution, you can go right ahead. The way to end this is to just go right back to the start and select the starting position. Then we're going to go back to our select tool, which is the pointer, and we're just going to change this to a color. The outline might be black for you, so again you want to hold down Shift and then you'll want to set the outline color by selecting the X on the palette. We can also change the opacity so we can see underneath right here by using the text field with an O. So we can sort of see how the gun looks underneath. I'm also going to trace on top of this in order to define the dark regions, so make sure you have the snapping options like I do on the right. The important part is to snap to the cusp nodes, and we're just going to trace them, and you'll see it automatically snaps to them, which is really nice. And I'm just going to trace out this dark region as well as leaving a bit of this lighter highlight. So yeah, just do the same thing. And I'm also going to trace out the light region, so the clipping might get a little bit annoying, so you can zoom in if you want to have it be a little bit less sensitive. Again, I'm going to select the two items and set them to different colors. I will also restore the opacity of the background shape just up to 100 again, just because it looks kind of ugly like this. But you can leave it if you want. Finally, I'm going to Shift Select in order to select multiple items and clear the outline by holding down Shift and selecting the X again. Okay. Great, so I will continue tracing out the other shapes, and I'll just speed up this part, and you can follow along if you want, or you can select your own shapes, depending on what you think is most prominent in this design. Once you've gotten to the trigger selection, you'll notice that we have something different here. We have a region of empty space surrounded by a region of filled space, so how do we handle that? Well, Inkscape provides a set of powerful path manipulation tools that let us operate on paths and regions contained by them. So let's turn down the opacity of this part, and let's trace out the trigger area. So we're going to just trace out the void this time rather than the shape by just following everything here. You don't need to make it as fine as I did, but it doesn't really matter. And you'll see that we have just filled in a region of empty space. And what we want to do is cut it out from the region that it's on top of. So we can select both of them with Shift Select, and then we can go to Path and Difference. And you'll see that what this does is subtract the void from the region underneath it. And so that is how we get our trigger area. Okay, so now we can continue to trace out the other sections of the weapon. Okay, and that's looking pretty cool all on its own. Let's open up a couple more windows. Align and Distribute is under Object, and we can select it, or you can hit Ctrl-Shift-A in order to open it up. The other panel we want to open is Fill and Stroke, so we can hit Ctrl-Shift-F or select it from the object properties, and you'll see these two panels open up in the right-hand side of your screen. There are options to dock it to the right side, and you can open them back up. I usually just prefer to leave it open. Let's do a group selection now, and in the select mode, you want to just hold down your mouse button and draw a rectangle over everything, and then we can just set the opacity in the Fill and Stroke tab down to 50% just to see what everything looks like underneath. And let's just trace out a couple more of these features. I don't know what these are for, but they look cool, so I'm just going to make one. And I'm also going to make a couple quick edits by selecting the edit path, or you can just double click on the path. And I'm going to just shade it dark blue as well as duplicate it since the two are the same with Ctrl-D. Okay, you also see these stripes, which I think are pretty predominant. Again, no idea what those are for. They'd probably weaken the barrel, but anyways. This is one of the uses of the second reference image that we have. So let's just go up there, and we're just going to make a couple of thin rectangles that are about the same thickness as the grooves. You can select it twice in order to change the setting to rotation, and you can drag the rotation handles, holding down Control in order to snap it to increments of 15 degrees. It doesn't have to be perfect, and we're just going to line it up. Don't worry if it goes sort of outside the lines. Then we can duplicate it. So we'll turn down the opacity a little bit just so we can see where we're putting our items, and we're just going to try to duplicate it by using Ctrl-D. Don't worry if the spacing is even. That is what the Align and Distribute tab lets us do. And so we'll just Shift select all of them, and then we'll go to Align and Distribute, and then we'll distribute horizontally by their centers. Then we'll duplicate this thing underneath that will basically let us take out a stencil of everything that is only overlapping. So now with this duplicated rectangle, again you can see there's one there. If we duplicate it, it'll end up on top. I'll just change that to a different color. So we want to take this stencil, or like a mask. We want to select those three items. We'll group them by using Ctrl-G or right-clicking, and we'll just Shift select both the grooves and the stencil. And then we'll go to Object, Clip, and Set, and that will let us trim everything that is outside that rectangular area, as well as destroying the rectangular area that we used as a stencil. So you can see why we duplicated it, otherwise we'd only be left with the grooves. This is a very common technique, and I will be using it frequently in this tutorial. Now we want to select our reference, and we're just going to move it out of the way. So you can hold down Alt, and then click on the area where your reference is, and you can drag it away. Alt lets you select things that are underneath other things, and this is also a useful thing to have. Okay, you can also see the white gaps here between the two things that are perfectly lined up. I think this is just a slight visual artifact, and we'll resolve this by creating a bit of overlap in a moment. Let's also just select everything again by holding down the mouse and just selecting rectangular area and setting the opacity to full. And I think we can start shading now. So we're going to use the eyedropper tool on the left in order to select a color. This is also present within the Fill tab, which lets us select the same sort of thing, just a color for the fill or the stroke. And we want to keep this not as complex as the original. There are a bunch of settings that let us change colors. I like HSL, but you can set it to anything you want. Whatever you're more comfortable with, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to duplicate a couple of colors and change around the shades just to make them line up a little bit. And what you want to focus here is on the relative color, so whether one section is darker or lighter than the other. For example, this segment of the barrel that's closer to the main part of the weapon is lighter. So we're going to set it to that, and the grooves are dark. So we just have a nice approximation here. We have that same overlap issue with a little bit of a white border since they're exactly lined up. So we want to select the parts that are underneath, and we're just going to drag them so there's a little bit of overlap. and you won't see those white borders show up anymore. You can see what I'm talking about, the clear white gap in between the two solid sections at the bottom. So we'll just make a bit of an overlap and clear that up. Okay, so now the barrel is going to be a little bit darker. You don't typically want to have adjacent shapes be the same color, just because that's a bit confusing. So we'll be careful with our color choice, but also not use too many different shades since that can become a bit overwhelming. Now that we've gotten to this area, we'll notice that there are a couple of imperfections. So you can double click on the path, or you can go to the edit path setting on the left that you can see. And what we're doing is just creating this little overlap threshold in order to remove those ugly white lines when we zoom out. It's really easy, just drag the nodes of the item that is underneath to make sure that they're hidden and there's a little bit of buffer space. And you want to do that for anywhere that you see those really narrow white lines. I'm going to speed up this part. It's just going to be more of the same of selecting colors so they match the relative shading that is shown on the reference, as well as hiding these overlays. So again, just double click and add a little bit of buffer space. This region has a lot of small details that I want to add, so I'm just going to select it and reduce the opacity. Then I will go to the circle tool, another generic polygon tool that lets us add in features, and we'll add this knob. So I'm just going to turn this a bright orange, and don't worry if it's overlapping. We're going to use that same clipping tool in order to trim off the parts that are not within the outline. You can also see this align tool lets us perfectly center items relative to each other. So I've duplicated it, and we're going to use clip and set in order to trim off everything that's outside. We're also going to set the stroke, so you can shift select a color on the palette to set it to the same color, or you can go to the stroke paint, and you can see that there's a lot of options under stroke style if you want to add arrows or dashes or things like that. We don't really care at this point. I think you won't be able to see anything, so we'll just set it to a solid line. The important part here is that we can change the thickness of the stroke, and we sort of want this to just match the indicator. Okay, we also might want to make it a little darker so it stands out a bit more, and we'll continue tracing the other parts. One minor change I'm going to make at this point is just to trace out the trigger. I think it would look better if the trigger was a different color. It's an important part, something that I want to draw the eye to, so I'm just going to make it a little bit darker than the rest of the object. Now that we're done with our tracing and shading, we should probably save this. Inkscape doesn't really have any great autosave options, so you want to save more frequently than I'm doing here. You can hit Ctrl S and you just save it wherever is convenient for you. Great, so now we can select our object and we can just group it with Ctrl G, or you can right click and select group just to make it into a single grouped object. We can scale it by using the scale handles when you select it, and you can hold down Control in order to scale it uniformly. If you accidentally rotate your canvas, by the way, by using Control and the scroll wheel, you can always reset it by going into the bottom right corner here and setting the canvas rotation to 0. Okay, so let's actually make the playing card part. Now that we have the foreground, we can add a bit more interest by framing it. You can use the rectangle tool again to just create a rectangle over top, and we're going to set the dimensions to a normal playing card of 2.5 by 3.5 inches. The units don't really matter that much since we're going to scale it anyways. It's not like we're trying to print this out. And if we were, then you'd probably want to be a bit more consistent. But yeah, so here's our playing card. We want to put this obviously behind our actual subject, so we can use the tools in the top in order to change that. But before we do that, let's make it rounded. So you can see these little circle handles at the corners, and they allow us to round the rectangle, and you can do it on both axes or just one. If you want to undo this, you can square out the corners by hitting that button in the upper right. So I'm just going to add a little bit of curve, and then I'm going to select our main object, and I'm just going to move it to the top. Alright, that's a bit not visible, so we'll change the color to something that's not just plain black. I also see a couple of mistakes here. So you can see that I put this trigger on top of a gray bit of the background. So what I'm going to do is delete that whole segment from the background. And you see that it just turns into a curve. So we'll just select the two edge points. I deleted a little bit too much there. So you want to do this properly. So we'll select this part, the large gray background. We'll select the part that we don't want, all the vertices, and press the delete key. And then we'll select the two things we want to make into a straight line, and then we'll connect the line segments straight. And that will straighten it out, which looks better. Okay, we'll group it back into the same object again, and then we will rotate it about, say, 45 degrees, and just move it around to see how it looks. This part also, I decided to make a different color than the reference, just because I think it looks better. You don't have to do this, it's just a bit of artistic license. Okay, time for some more background elements. So we'll use the circle tool and we'll create a large circle. You can hold down Control to make sure it is a perfect circle rather than an ellipse. And we'll center it on the card by selecting both and using the Align and Distribute tools. So note that you can hit Control in order to scale from the corner, or you can use Control-Shift to scale from the center. And we do want to scale from the center. So we'll set this to a nice color that stands out and doesn't sort of merge with anything. And you'll just pick it and nudge it around a bit. And we're going to put this behind our main object. We can also duplicate the circle in the middle, and we'll clear the fill by selecting the X for fill, and we'll add a stroke of the same color by using the eyedropper. Just for a nice sort of planetary effect. And we're going to add a little bit more color here by going and using the rectangle tool. So you'll see it's still rounded. Things tend to keep their default settings, so you can just unset that. I will clear the stroke here, and I'll add a fill of a nice yellowish color, something that sort of complements the red in the background. And we'll do a similar clipping operation, selecting both the thing we want to clip and the stencil, and we'll use clip set in order to crop it. And you'll notice that the thing underneath is the one that gets clipped, the other part gets destroyed. Okay, so let's also give it a little bit of a rotation. If you've accidentally grouped some objects, or you've added them while they were grouped, you can just right-click and click on Ungroup. And that's looking pretty cool. There might be a couple of small tweaks you want to make to the sizes and arrangements of things. You can always use the Align and Distribute tools in order to make exact adjustments. And here's a quick aside about how to make different styles of drop shadows. So I'm sure you've seen these everywhere. They seem to go in and out of popularity over time. What I'm going to do is I'll show you 3 different styles. So one is this sort of stroke highlight thing. You see that we have a stroke slightly offset from the actual fill, which can look cool in some instances. We also have the typical background blur, so it's duplicated, and underneath we have just a normal black rectangle of the same size. And we can change the blur and opacity to create this drop shadow manually. And you can also move it around if you like. You'll notice that we can also turn this same effect into a glow. So if we select it and change the shadow from black to the color of the fill, then it looks like it's glowing. And now for the effect I like the best. So I'm just going to duplicate it, set it to black, and I'm going to turn down the opacity. Then I'll move it to the back, use Alt to select it because it's behind the top object, and I'm just going to offset it a little bit. So we have this very minimalistic drop shadow, and I think that looks pretty cool. And yeah, there are a bunch of other ways to do this as well. And you'd be well off looking at some graphic design forums to look for ideas. Okay, so let's create a drop shadow for this gun. We can just duplicate it, and then we will set the fill to nothing, just a standard black color. You'll notice that it doesn't set the stroke. So we had the stroke for the knob set to a particular color, so we might just want to just delete that. You can zoom in on it, and you can just continually click on it until it becomes ungrouped. Then click on something else and come back, and it'll return to being in group mode. You also might want to disable snapping, so you can go to the right and disable those options. And we'll move it in place just underneath the gun to create a really nice, subtle looking drop shadow. And this is a really nice technique that's easy to execute. Just duplicate your object and set the fill to black, reduce its opacity near to 0, and you have a very easy drop shadow. You'll see that this still looks a little bit dull, and we might want to add a couple more features that make it look more like a playing card. So here's an introduction to the text tool. You can select it from the left panel, and we can just click anywhere and you can start typing. It is default, I think, to black, and we can scale it and manipulate just like any other object. So here's where the font will differ. If you installed Ralloway like I did at the start, there's a little bit more to it than what I showed, and it depends on your operating system. You can use it. I'm going to be using Ralloway Black, which is the heaviest form of this font, just because I think it looks good. So I'll just change it to heavy. These are all, by the way, things I had to install manually. It's easy as double clicking in Windows, but anyways. I'm going to call this the Spectre, since it is called the Spectre in game, and I'll just center it in the middle of the card. You can move it around and just tweak until it looks good. Now let's add a couple more card-like things. So I'm going to add a couple of rectangles just to hold stats and the like. I'll sample the color of the primary circle in the background, and I'm also going to add a bit of a curve to the edges. I'm going to make another one also just to specify the type of weapon this is, submachine gun. And I'll use the clip set technique as usual, duplicating the card background, selecting the thing I want to cut out, putting it underneath, and using clip set in order to cut out these pieces. Okay, and now we can start to populate them. So let's add a little bit of text first. I'm going to put the word SMG up here. You can just duplicate the word Spectre if you want and double click in order to open the text editing options. And I don't know, if you want to put it in the middle, say, I think that looks pretty cool. It's purely stylistic though. We're also going to add some numbers here for stats. So let's call them damage and handling. I'll show you how to make them part of the same string. You can just press enter to separate them, and if you want to change the spacing for lines in Inkscape, it's very easy. So it used to be a lot more complicated, but they fixed it in the update. And now you can just change the distance by just selecting that option in the top and changing the number down to something like 1. Okay, but you probably in this case don't want them to be two separate strings, so what we'll do instead is we'll separate them into different objects in a moment. Okay, so let's add a couple of circles now for custom icons that we'll make really quickly. So you can use the Shift Control to make a perfect circle. Let's color it white, and then we'll just put it in the center and sort of try to align it here. Now, the problem with having the text objects as part of the same object is that you can't orient them or manipulate them separately, which is a little bit annoying. So what we're going to do is separate them. I'm just going to delete the 6 from the bottom, and I'll duplicate the 2, double click on it, and just change that into a 6. And this is generally better. It's less confusing to orient, and now we can center the circles with the text, which is good. Now, in order to just make sure everything's center, we'll just do another align, and we can start adding some icons. So you can select the circle, and you can press 3 to automatically zoom in and fill the screen with it. And let's just add some bullets. So this is for damage. We'll just square out this rectangle. We'll just put it in place. We can use the align and distribute tools to do this again. And we'll use the circle tool to add a semicircle for the top of the bullet. You don't have to do it this way, but if you want, you can set the start to 180 degrees and the end to 0, and that gives us a semicircle, and you can undo it by selecting the appropriate buttons in the top bar. Now we'll just center it on the bullet, and we will maybe expand it a little bit. Then we can duplicate this bullet, and we'll just make another little section at the bottom. We'll try to sort of distribute it evenly and shrink it down to a good size. Then we can combine into one object with Ctrl-G and duplicate it left and right. Make sure to just group it all as a single object, since that will make your life easier, and distribute it so it's even. It looks okay. We might want to just set the fill to a pure black, just for all of them, so you can select multiple things and set their fill at the same time. Very useful. You might not want to go full black because it doesn't leave you with much space to go, so you always want to leave a little bit of room, maybe a lightness of 6. And we're going to do a similar thing here for the speed. So these are just going to be sort of 2 carets, and we'll use we can type literal carets in the using the text tool. I figure this doesn't look as good, so what I'm going to do instead is I'll use the polygon tool. So this lets you create arbitrary polygons with a lot of options. I'll just change the number of corners to 3 for now, and I will flip it on the horizontal. Okay, and then we'll just duplicate it, and we'll use the same trick we did with the trigger area. We'll use path difference in order to subtract the area. That was a little bit too far, so we'll just undo it with Ctrl-Z and shrink it a bit, duplicate it a few times, arrange it nicely, and move it in the middle. So you'll want to also set these 3 as part of the same object, and select them, hit Ctrl-G, and then we'll center it in the circle. Great. Now if you want to make a little bit of that same drop shadow idea, we can just duplicate this all. Using Ctrl-D, we'll set the color to black, reduce the opacity, and we'll move it to the bottom. A good way to do this, since we have a bunch of separate objects, is to group it first before we move it to the bottom. And we can use the layer management tools to make sure that works correctly, just to get it right underneath. Then we can alt select and drag in order to give a little bit of offset. Okay, and that's looking not bad. So we might want to do the same thing with the SMG text. So here's another way of making those drop shadows. Set the color first to black, duplicate it, and then return the color to whatever it was originally. Okay, here's a slightly better color for the background, I think. It's a desaturated navy-ish. And it looks okay. You can see I accidentally grouped the shadow with the gun, so I'm going to ungroup it here, and I'll turn up the opacity just so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And let's also fill in the background. So what we can do is duplicate the word Spectre, and this is a graphic design style that I'm stealing off of Riot's motion graphics. It's very cool, so we're just going to add a stroke of pure white, and we're going to remove the fill, and we're going to set the opacity to something a bit lower in a moment. And we're just going to use this as a background. So I'm just going to duplicate it a couple times so that we'll fill up the entire screen. And don't worry if the spacing is uneven. We don't need to worry about that for now. You might actually want to set this to a different color stroke, but let me just select them all and shift select to set the stroke to something that's actually visible. This might take a couple tries. Okay, I think green would work here. Let's just set everything to that same shade of green. And we'll move it to the side. Okay, so let's lay this out nicely. We can just use the align and distribute tool to vertically distribute them, but you see that they overlap. So one cool thing is we can just delete a bunch of them, and align and distribute will let us distribute everything perfectly between just the top and the bottom, and you can see that works out pretty well. We might also want to offset things horizontally. This will cause some parts of the text to come off the side of the card, so instead we'll duplicate it horizontally and we'll do the offsets here. Then when we move everything back, we'll make sure that the offsets are centered on the card so that none of it is going to overflow or underflow. And I just noticed, I didn't do this intentionally, but I just realized that you can spell respect here. Okay, interesting coincidence. Let's just group it all. We'll move it pretty much over top of everything because I think this looks the best. Everything except for the text and the gun, of course. So we'll just move it there by using the layer manipulation tools. We'll turn down the opacity, and then we're going to alt select the card, duplicate it, and use the same clip and set technique in order to make sure it only fills that area. And we'll set the stroke paint to the original white color. Okay, and that's looking pretty good. Let's add a drop shadow for the whole card by duplicating it. You can see that it's easy to duplicate the wrong thing here. I selected the text by accident since it's the same shape. So you want to make sure the thing you've selected is correct. You could, for example, just change the color just to make sure. Then we'll duplicate it. We'll turn down the opacity and set the color to black. We'll move it right underneath and we'll offset it a bit. Let's also add a border to the card. We'll just select it and give it that same pinkish salmon color as the rest of the primary elements. And the last thing we're going to do is do some text manipulations. So these are some of the more complex operations that you'll have to deal with. Not because it's super hard, but just it's a little bit finicky working with text here, and Inkscape has a couple of weird rules. So let's just move it off the card for now. What I want to do is take a part of the middle and shift it back. But this is not as easy as just using the fill and stroke method from before. You can see that if I try that, I'm going to just move that to the top. So let's duplicate the text, and then let me just cut out the correct shape. And you see that if I move it, the part of the text is still there, so it doesn't look like it got offset, more like there's a copy that got moved. So instead we're going to have to fake it. There are a couple of ways to do it. My idea is to just subtract it and then fill it with the clip and set. So first we'll change the text to a path by going under path and object to path, and then we'll ungroup it. It's implicitly grouped, which is a bit confusing. Then we want to combine it into the same object by using union. so that when you double click on it, you'll see that all of them have editable node points. And by the way, you won't be able to change the text after this. And then now, if we use the difference tool, we'll be able to actually subtract out of the text. And you can see I rotated the canvas again. We'll reset that. Okay, so now we need to fill that area with a clip set. So let's duplicate both the rectangle we're subtracting and moving and the actual text. So we'll do a clip and set first, and we'll move that out of the way. Then we're going to do a subtract by using path difference, and then we'll move them back together. And now we can offset it, and that is the look I'm going for. Note that I've changed these colors so they're not white, otherwise we wouldn't be able to see them. Now we can move it back, make sure the alignment's right, so you can double click to ungroup or sort of edit within the group. And we'll change the fill back to white. And now we can zoom out and look at our final product. So it's looking pretty good. Now if you want to export this, you can go to File, Export PNG Image, and make sure you have Export Area Selection selected there. You want to make sure that the card is completely selected, which is what this selection thing does. You can change the file name and the DPI to change the resolution, and you can hit export to finally save it to your file system. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this and you learned something new, make sure to leave a sub, it really helps me out. Also, if you want to see more content like this in the future, let me know. Now that it's summer, I have a little bit less work to do, so I can put these out every 2 weeks rather than every month. I will stick to my current schedule of putting out a devlog on the 1st of every month, but now in between devlogs, I'm going to put out a separate video on a special topic. Next month's is probably going to be on a digital note-taking setup that is much improved over my previous one. Alright, stay safe and I'll see you in the next video.